Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I developed pneumonia during Christmas break of my second year in college. Earlier that fall, I had come down with a sinus infection, and like the responsible adult I was trying to be, I'd gone to the doctor who prescribed a simple course of antibiotics that he felt would help me to recover. I'd taken the antibiotics faithfully for several days, and I'd begun to feel better. I felt so much better, in fact, that like an irresponsible child, I stopped taking the medication. Now, I was fine for several days, but by the end of the week, I was sick again. I thought it was just allergies since I was busy with the end of the semester projects and exams. I decided to end up putting off going back to the doctor. Day after day, as the semester drew to a close, I grew weaker and sicker. It was all I could do to drive the 2 hours home after my last exam of the semester. And when I got home, I went to sleep and I slept. That night, though, was one of the most difficult nights of my life. Every time I tried to take a breath, it felt like someone was stabbing me in the chest. My whole body rattled as I tried to breathe. My parents wanted me to go to the hospital, but I insisted that I would wait for the morning and go to my family doctor instead. My mother wasn't convinced by my bravado. She was deeply concerned that I had developed double pneumonia and would only get sicker with another night at home. But I was just too stubborn to listen. Needless to say, I couldn't sleep by that point. If I started to doze off, the rattling in my chest or a fit of coughing woke me, and I was miserable. As the night wore on, I grew scared. Sometime in the middle of the night, my mom came into my room and sat down beside my bed. She took a hold of my hand and said a prayer over me. She put a cool cloth on my forehead and just sat there with me. Her presence, the warmth of her hand, and the assurance that I wasn't alone was enough comfort to calm my body, and I slept again for a few fitful hours. When I awoke the next morning, my mom was still sitting beside my bed, asleep herself, and still holding my hand. Trip to the doctor and a shot of steroids and a shot of antibiotics and a full course of antibiotics that followed, completely finished this time, mind you. And 2 weeks of rest, and I was able to recover from that bout with pneumonia. But I'll never forget my mother's presence by my bed that night. It gave me the courage to let go and to trust that I wasn't alone and that the morning would come. There are moments in all our lives when life seems so uncertain, the future seems so unclear, and the world just seems so broken. We yearn for someone to set up with us, to hold our hand, to assure us that the dawn is coming, and to wait with us for the light of that new day to break. Such was the time in which the prophet wrote those verses from Isaiah that we heard read today. The prophet is writing to a bedraggled group of refugees who had returned from exile in Babylon. They had looked forward to the return, and many of them had left behind comfortable lives in exile, only to discover a country in ruins whose residents welcomed them with anything but open arms. There is no temple, there is no Davidic ruler. They are still subjects of a foreign land. Their hopes were dashed by the reality of what they found. In the midst of their despair, they cry out to God, "Where are you? Why aren't you acting like you acted with our ancestors?" The prophet gives voice to their lament in the words we read today. The people cry out to God, "Tear open the heavens, come down, shake the foundations of this world again. Do as you did with Sarah and Abraham, with Rebekah and Isaac, with Leah and Rachel and Jacob, with Miriam and Moses, with David, with all of our ancestors. Do something." Those words give voice to the tearful pleas of a people who wonder where God is in the midst of their suffering. Yet they don't end with despair. It's as if there's a pause in the wailing between the end of verse 7 and the beginning of verse 8. In English, it's translated as yet. It's a rest, it's a moment of contemplation that leads to a remembrance that the God who was with them in those years of exile is still with them. They are still the people of God, and the Holy One of Israel, who liberated them from slavery in Egypt, is still their God. In the midst of their despair, they cling to the hope that is theirs as heirs of the covenant. No matter what, God is still with them. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians echo that tone of hope. The apostle was writing to the church in Corinth, which, much like the church in Rome, struggled with divisions between Gentiles and Jews, those in bondage and those in positions of power and privilege. Like so many early Christians, they have found themselves weary of waiting for the return of Jesus, for it's now been decades since the resurrection, and yet Jesus has yet to return in their eyes. Paul's words challenge them to cling to the truth that God is still at work among them, that God has poured out countless gifts upon them and asks them to use those gifts in the service of others. His greeting in these first verses of the letter ends with a reminder that the God who was faithful in calling them to follow Jesus, who has given them every gift under the heavens, is faithful in all things and will sustain them till the end. Paul acknowledges their yearning, but reminds them to abide in hope. God is faithful in all things. Our verses from Mark today comprise what is often referred to as the little apocalypse. That is, this chapter sounds a lot more like the book of Revelation than it does the Gospels. Apocalyptic writing is often called writing of hope because it is usually born among communities that feel left out, forgotten, and oppressed. These words from Jesus come in the midst of a conversation with the disciples just after leaving the temple, after watching the poor widow give her 2 coins in the offering. The disciples point out the beauty and the majesty of the temple as if it's something to be admired. And you can almost hear the tone of frustration behind Jesus' words as he replies that the stones that compose those impressive buildings will be destroyed in the coming leveling of the world when God will make all things right. The disciples are terrified and ask, When? When will this be? And Jesus goes on to say that there will be much pain and heartache and injustice and violence that has to be endured before the reign of God will be established in its fullness. Jesus says it will be as if the sun itself has gone out, as if the very stars of the heavens will have fallen and the earth will be shrouded in shadows. And in the midst of those deep shadows, the light of the world will finally be seen, coming in the glory of a new world that is built on justice and compassion, a world that is filled with righteousness and love. It will be a sign like that first spark of light that breaks the deepest night and signals the coming dawn of a new day. As if he anticipates that some may hear those words and think they sound just too poetic and otherworldly, too dreamy to make sense. Jesus offers a more practical example. He goes back to the agricultural analogies that are grounded in the lived experience of his audience. He says, as soon as you see the sprouts on the fig tree, as soon as its leaves burst forth, you know that winter is soon past and summer will soon be upon you. Jesus invites those who hear these words to look honestly at the state of the world, to admit the brokenness, the heartache, the injustice, and to trust that God is already at work, that the night, however long it may seem, will not last forever. But as the old African proverb reminds us, no matter how long the night, the dawn will come. The question still lingers, though. When? When will all of this happen? How long must the night be? How long must the children of God endure? Jesus says that even those who hear his words in those moments will live to see the breaking of the dawn. You see, God is already at work in the world, already turning the world around to a new day. Perhaps even now, we can catch glimpses of the truth of what Jesus says. We can look around the world and see so much brokenness, so much heartache. Yet we can also see signs, points of light. We see simple acts of kindness and we hear gentle words of hope. We're occasionally party to courageous acts of compassion and powerful stories of transformation. There is a light breaking upon us, but for so many, the night seems so very long. Family situations that never seem to get any better, jobs that drain the life out of us, financial problems that never seem to go away, the aching loss of a loved one that never seems to heal, and this awful pandemic that only seems to grow worse as the days wear on. The night seems ever so long. And so we ask with the disciples, when? When will all of this finally happen? When will the world finally be made whole? The response from Jesus is that only God knows the day and the hour. Only God knows the moment when things will finally and completely turn around. But Jesus invites us to trust. He invites us to stay awake, to watch for the coming dawn, to join the vigil of the ages as we wait for the new heavens and the new earth that God has promised. The good news that Jesus brings, perhaps even more than that the dawn is coming, is that we do not watch and wait alone. Throughout the Bible, we see a God who is an anxious parent, staying up through the deepest hours of the night, holding the hand of a broken and bleeding creation, a God whose very heart is broken by the state of the world. We see a God who refuses to leave us to our own devices, who takes us by the hand and sings a soothing lullaby of peace to us. To the parents who have lost their children, to the victims of hunger and poverty, to those suffering from disease and from the ravages of old age, to those who languish in loneliness and isolation, to those who suffer hatred and oppression, to those caught in the vicious cycle of violence, to all who ask, how long? There comes the invitation to join the watch for a new day of peace and healing. In Jesus Christ, God invites all of us to join the song of the angels, that beautiful lullaby of hope. God invites us to stay awake and watch with eager anticipation for the coming of the dawn. May we watch with hope, trusting that God is with us all through the night. Amen.